"Lock her in," Commander Hayes said, and the gate slammed shut before anyone could speak. 4 military K9 animals that had hospitalized 3 handlers turned toward the woman standing alone inside the kennel. The trainees pressed forward, phones raised, waiting for the screaming to begin. Rachel Morgan didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood perfectly still, closed her eyes for 3 full seconds, and when she opened them, the largest dog on the base walked to her side and sat down. The laughter stopped. If you're watching this right now, subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first time Commander Victor Hayes noticed Rachel Morgan, he decided she was a problem. Not because she caused trouble, not because she fell behind during drills, or complained during the long marches that started before dawn and ended after dark. Not because she talked back or questioned orders, or made the kind of mistakes that gave instructors ammunition. She was a problem because she didn't do any of those things. 6 weeks into her arrival at Camp Blackridge, Rachel Morgan had not once failed a physical qualification. She had not once reported an injury. She had not once asked for a modification or rest period or any accommodation whatsoever. She woke up before the rest of the barracks returned after everyone else had gone to sleep, and in between those hours, she outperformed recruits half her age without ever appearing to try. And that was the part that irritated Hayes most deeply. She never appeared to try. She just did things. Quietly, efficiently, without fanfare, and without explanation. The kind of competence that didn't announce itself. The kind that sat in the corner and watched, that answered only when spoken to, that moved like it had already been through every situation you thought was new. Hayes had spent 22 years training soldiers. He had broken recruits who came in thinking they were gods. He had reshaped overconfident young men who believed their athletic records would carry them through. He had watched decorated officers crack under real pressure, and he had watched ordinary kids rise to become something extraordinary. But he had never encountered someone quite like Rachel Morgan. And because he could not categorize her, he did not trust her. "She's hiding something," he told Sergeant First Class Eddie Carver on a Thursday morning 3 weeks before the night that would change everything at Camp Blackridge. They were standing at the edge of the training field watching the recruits run a circuit that most of them despised. "Nobody moves like that without a reason." Carver watched Rachel cross the last obstacle, a rope wall that regularly ate time and energy, and drop down on the other side without breaking stride. "Maybe she's just good," he said. "Nobody is just good," Hayes said flatly. "Good comes from somewhere, and whatever her somewhere is, it's not in her file." He had read her file 3 times. Rachel Morgan, 39 years old. Prior service listed as administrative support. Non-combat roles, early discharge due to family circumstances. No decorations. No formal combat training on record. No special operations history. No K9 certification. Nothing that explained why she ran like someone who had been running in hostile environments for most of her adult life. Nothing that explained why she never flinched during the stress inoculation exercises that were specifically designed to make people flinch. Nothing that explained why during the live scenario simulation 2 weeks earlier, she had moved through a mock building clearance with the instinctual geometry of someone who had done it for real. Her file was clean. Too clean. Hayes had seen files like that before. He'd seen them on operators who went so deep into classified work that their records became fiction. Government fiction carefully written and plausibly boring. The kind of file that said absolutely nothing and therefore said everything. But he couldn't prove it. And until he could, Rachel Morgan was just a quiet older recruit with unusually good instincts and the kind of calm that made younger trainees nervous. She made Hayes nervous too. He just refused to admit it. The K9 unit at Camp Blackridge had a reputation that everyone acknowledged and nobody talked about openly. 4 dogs. 3 Belgian Malinois and 1 German Shepherd named Titan, who stood close to 90 pounds and had the kind of eyes that made experienced handlers take an involuntary step backward. These were not dogs that sat beside you and waited for praise. These were dogs that assessed you in the first 30 seconds and had already determined whether you were worth their loyalty or not. 3 of them had been pulled from active deployment for behavioral assessments that kept coming back unresolved. The 4th Titan had been flagged after an incident with a handler during a training exercise that put the man in the hospital for 11 days. Nobody spoke about that incident in direct terms. They spoke around it. They used words like complicated and unpredictable and high drive, which were the polite ways of saying this dog is not like the others and we're not sure what to do with him. Sergeant Daniel Brooks ran the K9 unit. He was a 15-year dog handler with a chest full of quiet accomplishments and the kind of tired wisdom that came from watching both animals and people get broken by bad circumstances. He loved these 4 dogs in the practical way that serious dog people love difficult animals, not sentimentally but with deep professional respect for what they were and fury at what had been done to them. These dogs aren't broken, he told anyone who would listen. They've been failed. There's a difference. Most people stopped listening after the 3rd time he said it. Brooks had submitted 3 formal requests to transfer the dogs to a specialized rehabilitation program. All 3 had been denied. The dogs were technically still military assets, still on the base's roster, still generating paperwork. They just weren't doing anything useful because nobody could work with them safely. Hayes had a different view. They're a liability, he told Brooks during one of their regular disagreements on the subject. If we can't use them, we shouldn't keep them. We're not giving up on them, Brooks said. That's a decision above your pay grade, Sergeant. Brooks kept his expression neutral. He was good at that. Understood, sir. But he didn't move on them. Not yet. What Hayes didn't know, and what Brooks had not yet told anyone, was that he had been watching Rachel Morgan too. Not with suspicion. With recognition. Something about the way she moved around the base perimeter on her early morning runs, the route she took, that happened to pass the K9 facility twice each lap. Something about the way she slowed down almost imperceptibly when she passed the kennel runs. The way she angled her body just slightly so that the dogs could read her body language without her having to stop. She was communicating with them every morning before anyone else was awake. Brooks had seen it for the first time on a Wednesday 3 weeks ago. He'd been up early dealing with a medication schedule for one of the Malinois and had caught a glimpse of Rachel through the chain link. She hadn't stopped moving, but she had slowed down just enough and her hands had dropped to her sides and her shoulders had done something relaxed in a very specific way, and Titan, who barked at everything, had tracked her with his eyes in absolute silence. Brooks stood very still and watched her go. Then he went inside and pulled out his phone and looked up a name from 11 years ago. Lieutenant Rachel Walker. The file that came back was of course nearly empty. But Brooks remembered. He remembered the mission briefings that mentioned a handler so effective she was listed only by call sign. He remembered the stories that came back from teams operating in forward positions, stories about a woman who could walk into a situation that had gone sideways and stabilize it with a dog that had been given up for lost. He remembered that those stories stopped coming about 7 years ago without explanation, the way classified things stopped when you weren't supposed to be asking anymore. He looked at Rachel Morgan's photo on the base personnel roster. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went to make his rounds, and he did not say anything to anyone. Not yet, because he was not certain, and because he suspected that Rachel Morgan, whoever she actually was, had come here for reasons that weren't his to expose. The night Hayes decided to make an example of her began with paperwork. It was almost comical. It began with a scheduling error in the training roster. Rachel's name had been entered into a slot for a specialized handling assessment that she had never signed up for, and which under normal circumstances required months of certification, prerequisites she had not officially completed. Hayes saw the error, and he made a decision. He could have corrected it. He could have moved her name to the standard drill rotation with everyone else. That would have been the reasonable administrative response. Instead, he picked up his pen and wrote her name in larger letters. Then he called a full training yard assembly for the following evening. All 32 trainees, he told Carver. Full attendance. I want the K9 unit supervisor present, and I want the 4 problem dogs in the main kennel run." Carver looked at him carefully. "Sir, if you're thinking about putting her in with those animals without proper—" "I'm thinking about running a practical assessment," Hayes said. "If she's as capable as she seems to believe she is, she'll handle it. Those dogs have injured handlers with 20 years of certification." "Then she should decline the assessment," Hayes said. "And that will tell us everything we need to know about her, won't it?" Carver didn't say anything else, but he found Rachel Morgan 30 minutes before the assembly and told her quietly what was coming. She listened without changing her expression. "Do you want me to document this?" Carver asked. "Because what he's planning is—" "No," Rachel said. "Don't document anything yet." "Morgan, those dogs are not manageable without proper—" "I know," she said. Carver studied her face. "You're not scared?" It wasn't a question. "Not of the dogs," she said. The training yard assembly gathered at 1800 hours. 32 recruits, 8 support staff. Sergeant Brooks, who had been given no prior information and arrived to find his 4 dogs already moved into the demonstration kennel and his blood pressure climbing fast. And Commander Victor Hayes, standing at the front of the gathering with the composed authority of a man who had spent 2 decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered. Rachel stood at the edge of the formation. She had not said a word since Carver warned her. Hayes opened with a speech about the nature of military service. He talked about standards and expectations and the fundamental requirement that every person at Camp Blackridge be able to operate under genuine pressure, not just training pressure. He talked about how fear was information, and how the inability to manage fear was not a character flaw, but it was a disqualifying factor in certain roles. He talked for about 4 minutes. Nobody looked bored, because everyone in that formation had already heard the rumors, already seen the 4 dogs loaded into the kennel run, and already understood that whatever Hayes was building toward was going to involve Rachel Morgan and those dogs, and some kind of confrontation that was going to be either instructive or deeply wrong, depending on how you looked at it. "Morgan," Hayes said. She stepped forward. "You were entered into a practical assessment for K9 handling capability." He held up the paperwork. "This assessment requires a candidate to enter an active kennel situation and demonstrate basic management of high-drive military working dogs." He paused. "Do you have any objection to completing this assessment tonight?" The yard was absolutely silent. Rachel looked at the paperwork. Then she looked at Hayes. "No objection, Commander." Hayes smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Good. The rules are simple. You enter the kennel run. You remain inside for 10 minutes. You demonstrate your ability to manage the animals present." He gestured toward the gate. "If at any point you feel unsafe, signal and we will open the gate immediately." "Understood," Rachel said. Behind him, Brooks stepped forward. "Commander, with respect, those 4 animals have not been cleared for assessment use. 2 of them have active behavioral flags on file. I need to formally object to—" "Your objection is noted, Sergeant," Hayes said without turning around. "Stand down." Brooks looked at Rachel. She met his eyes. He saw something in them that stopped him from saying anything else. He stepped back, but he didn't step away from the gate. They opened the kennel door, and Hayes gestured with one arm, a theatrical sweep like he was introducing something on a stage. "After you, Morgan." Rachel walked to the gate. She didn't pause at the entrance. She didn't hesitate or take a breath or do any of the things people do when they're steeling themselves for something frightening. She walked in the way she walked everywhere, with the measured, unhurried gait that had been making Hayes suspicious for 6 weeks, and the gate closed behind her with a sound that rang through the yard like a period at the end of a sentence. The laughing started almost immediately. 2 recruits in the back row, then a third. Someone whispered something and someone else laughed harder, and Hayes let it happen because the laughter served his point, which was that this woman was going to understand tonight that confidence required credentials, and credentials required demonstration. And she had demonstrated nothing except a talent for appearing calm. Inside the kennel, the 4 dogs had registered her entrance. Titan moved first. He always moved first. That was part of what made him Titan. He weighed 92 pounds of trained muscle and approximately zero patience for uncertainty. And when he moved toward someone in a confined space, people ran. People who knew better ran. People who had worked with high-drive dogs for years ran because Titan running at you was a biological override, a thing that bypassed training and went directly to the prehistoric part of the brain that had been keeping humans alive by running from large predators since before language existed. The trainees surged forward against the fence. Someone actually yelped. Hayes crossed his arms. Rachel stopped walking. She did not turn to face Titan directly. She angled her body about 15 degrees off-center. Her right shoulder slightly forward, and she dropped both her hands to her sides and she exhaled. A long, audible exhale that was absolutely controlled. And then she was still. Titan covered the last 8 feet at speed. 3 trainees screamed. One of them turned away. Titan stopped. Not because anything blocked him, not because anyone shouted a command, or because he hit a fence line, or because anything external intervened. He stopped on his own 3 feet from Rachel, and he lowered his head, and he held it there, his chin dropping toward the ground in a gesture that anyone who had spent serious time with dogs would have recognized immediately. Hayes did not recognize it. Brooke, standing at the fence, made a sound that was not quite a word. Rachel waited. She waited a full 30 seconds. Then she crouched down. Not quickly, not submissively. She crouched the way someone crouches who is entirely comfortable with what is happening and has all the time in the world. She held out her hand, palm down, and she said something. Quietly. It was less than 5 words, and nobody outside the kennel caught the words, but the tone was unmistakable, level, warm, certain. Titan took the last 3 steps. He lowered his head completely. He pressed his forehead against her palm. "What?" Someone in the formation started. "Quiet," Hayes said sharply. But his voice had changed. The 2 Malinois who had been circling stopped circling. They moved toward Rachel the same way Titan had, not in a challenge posture, but in something that looked disturbingly like recognition. The 4th dog, a Malinois named Coda, who had been flagged for the most severe behavioral instability on record, sat down in the far corner of the kennel and watched. Rachel stood back up slowly. All 3 dogs that had moved toward her were now positioned around her. Not randomly. Around her. The space between them and her was deliberate. They were orienting to her. Hayes stared. "What is she doing?" someone said. "Nothing," Brooks said quietly from his position at the gate. He was watching with an expression that had gone very still. "She's doing nothing. That's exactly the point." Hayes turned. "What did you say?" "I said she's not doing anything, sir," Brooks said. "She's just being. She's just standing there being completely settled, and those dogs who have not settled for anyone on this base in 8 months, are responding to her because she is the first person who has walked in there without fear or dominance or agenda." He paused. "And they know the difference." Hayes looked back at the kennel. Rachel had placed her hand on Titan's collar. Titan's eyes were closed. A sound passed through the formation. Not a laugh, not a comment, something involuntary. The kind of sound a crowd makes when it collectively understands that what it is watching is not what it expected to watch. "Open the gate," Hayes said. "The 10 minutes aren't. Open the gate, Carver." Rachel walked out of the kennel at her own pace. She didn't rush. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look at Hayes, or at the formation, or at anyone in particular. She looked back at the dogs briefly, the way you look at something you're leaving temporarily and want to remember where it is. And then she walked through the gate and stood in the yard. Hayes was 2 feet from her. His arms were still crossed, but the posture had gone stiff in a way that was different from authority. It was the stiffness of a man recalibrating. "Explain that," he said. "There's nothing to explain, Commander. 4 K9s that have refused every handler on this base for 8 months. They didn't refuse handlers," Rachel said. Her voice was level, not cold, not aggressive, just precise. "They refused people who approached them as problems to be solved. That's different. And you're what, some kind of natural talent? No, sir. Then what are you? She held his gaze. Someone who's been where those dogs have been, she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the training yard. Hayes didn't have a response ready. In 22 years, he had always had a response ready. He had built his entire identity on the ability to push until something gave, and what he had just watched had not given. It had simply been immovable in a way that didn't involve resistance at all. He turned and walked. He did not dismiss the formation. He did not say anything else. He simply turned and walked back toward the command building at the pace of a man who is holding himself together through force of will alone. Carver watched him go. Then he looked at Rachel. "You know what you just did," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I know," she said. "He's not going to leave this alone." "I know that too." Brooks appeared beside her. The yard was beginning to disperse slowly with the reluctant movement of people who don't want to stop watching something, and Brooks moved like he had a specific purpose, which he did. He stopped close to her, and he spoke quietly enough that nobody else would catch it. "Titan hasn't let anyone touch his collar in 11 months, he said. Rachel didn't answer. Not for food, not for medical. They've had to sedate him twice for vet procedures because he wouldn't allow contact. Brooks looked at her steadily. "He put his head in your hand." "He was ready," she said. "Someone just had to wait for him to be ready." Brooks was quiet for a moment. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks, he said. "Your morning runs, the route you take." She met his eyes. "I know who you are," he said. Not an accusation, not a threat. Just a statement delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who had already done his math and arrived at an answer he wasn't entirely surprised by. Rachel said nothing. "I'm not going to say it out loud," Brooks said. "Not here, not tonight." He glanced toward the kennel where the 4 dogs had settled in a way nobody had seen them settle in close to a year. "But I think you came back for them." She looked at the kennel too. "Someone had to," she said. Brooks nodded. "Once." "Then for what it's worth," he said. "I'm glad you're here." He walked back to his dogs. Rachel stood in the emptying yard. Somewhere across the base in the direction Hayes had walked, a door had just closed. She could feel what was coming. It was the same feeling she'd had in 7 different countries under 7 different sets of circumstances. The feeling of standing at the top of the first hill, before everything accelerates, when you can see clearly what's about to happen. And you understand that you have already made all the choices that led to this moment. And the only thing left is to be ready. She was ready. She had been ready for a long time. She turned and walked back toward the barracks. The 4 dogs watched her go. Every single one of them. In the kennel where no handler had stood safely for nearly a year, Titan raised his head one last time, and then he lay down quietly in the direction she had gone, and he closed his eyes. 3 recruits were still standing near the fence when it happened. One of them, a young man named Pryor, 23 years old, former college wrestler. Someone who had spent the last 6 weeks quietly convinced that Rachel Morgan was either running some kind of angle or somehow cheating the physical metrics, watched Titan settle and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name. "She knew them," he said to the 2 recruits beside him. "Not an observation, a conclusion." "What do you mean she knew them?" the woman to his left said. "Her name was Castillo. She'd been in the formation closest to the fence. She walked in there like she already knew them, like she'd met them before." Pryor shook his head slowly. "Dogs don't do that. Dogs don't just..." He gestured toward the kennel. "They don't just decide in 30 seconds. That takes time. That takes serious time." "Maybe she's just that good with animals," Castillo said. "Nobody is that good with Titan." Pryor looked toward the command building where Hayes had disappeared. "And Hayes knows it." Castillo looked at the gate where Rachel had walked out. "Who is she?" she said. The third recruit, a quiet young man from rural Tennessee named Briggs, who had barely spoken in 6 weeks, said something so quietly they almost missed it. "I don't know," he said, "but I think somebody does." He looked toward the K-9 facility where Brooks had disappeared after Rachel, "and I think somebody's been keeping it to themselves for a reason." The three of them stood there for another moment. The yard was almost empty. Somewhere in the kennel behind them, in a building that had held 4 animals nobody could reach, there was silence. Real silence. The kind that comes after something important has happened, and the world is still catching up to it. They walked back to the barracks without saying anything else. But none of them slept well that night. Because there is a specific kind of discomfort that comes from watching your assumptions fail in real time. Watching the story you had built about someone collapse without warning, replaced by something larger and stranger and more unsettling than the simple story you'd been telling yourself. Rachel Morgan was not who they had decided she was, and now they had to figure out who she actually was. That question would keep 36 people awake at Camp Blackridge that night. It would haunt Victor Hayes in particular, because Hayes, unlike the recruits, had access to resources. And by morning, he was going to use every one of them to find an answer. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the answer would destroy him. Not because it was false, but because it was true. And because the truth about Rachel Morgan was the kind of truth that didn't just change one man's position at one military base. It changed the conversation about what this place had been doing and what it had failed to protect, and what it had spent 8 months calling a liability, instead of looking at itself hard enough to understand what it had lost. Titan lay quiet in the kennel. The first real rest he'd had in close to a year. And somewhere in the barracks, Rachel Morgan lay on her back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the 4 dogs she'd walked away from tonight. She thought about what they needed. She thought about what they had been through. She thought about the fact that they had chosen her, and what that meant, and the weight of that kind of trust, which is not like any other kind of trust, because it is given without language, without explanation, without the ability to negotiate or qualify or take back. She thought about a German shepherd she had known 7 years ago who had given her that same trust in a far worse place than this, and what had happened to that dog, and why she was here. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was going to be difficult. Hayes was going to move against her. She had walked into his demonstration and turned it inside out in front of 32 witnesses, and men who built their identities on control did not forget that kind of moment. They came back at it. They came back at it harder and with more resources, and with the full weight of institutional authority behind them. She had known this was a possibility when she accepted the placement at Camp Blackridge. She had accepted it anyway, because the 4 dogs in that kennel had been waiting for someone, and nobody else was coming. The decision when she'd made it had not felt heroic. It had not felt like a mission, or a calling, or any of the language people used when they talked about service. It had felt like the only thing left to do. The way certain things feel when you've spent enough time running from them that you finally recognize running as the harder option. She turned on her side. In the dark, she thought of Titan's head pressing into her palm. The absolute weight of it. The absolute surrender. She slept. Hayes didn't sleep. That was the first thing Carver noticed when he arrived at the command building at 05:30 the following morning, and found Hayes already at his desk, a cold cup of coffee beside him, and a stack of printed documents spread across the surface with the focused disorder of a man who had been working through the night on a single problem. The problem had a name: Rachel Morgan. "You pulled her file again," Carver said. It wasn't a question. "I pulled everything," Hayes said without looking up. "Every database we have access to. Every cross-reference I could find. Service records, medical personnel transfers, training certifications going back 15 years. He finally looked up. His eyes had the specific flatness of someone who had not rested and was running on controlled fury. "You know what I found? The same thing you found the last 3 times, Carver said. "Nothing." Hayes pushed the stack of papers across the desk. A woman with 10 years of administrative support roles, a general discharge, and 00 documented combat or specialized training history. He stood up. And last night, she walked into that kennel and did something that Daniel Brooks has been trying to do with those dogs for 8 months. Maybe Brooks isn't. Daniel Brooks has 15 years with military working dogs and 2 combat deployments, Hayes said sharply. Don't finish that sentence. Carver was quiet. Hayes moved to the window. There is information in her record that has been removed, he said. Deliberately removed. That is not speculation, that is the only explanation for what I watched last night and what her file says about her. He turned around. I want to know who pulled it. I want to know what was there. And I want to know what she's actually doing at this base. Sir, Carver said carefully, if her record has been deliberately scrubbed, that means someone with significant authority ordered it scrubbed. Pulling that thread could, I don't care what it could do. It could pull back on you. Hayes stared at him. Are you telling me to leave this alone? I'm telling you to be careful about what you're digging for, Carver said. Because if she's protected at a level above this base, and you go at her hard enough to make noise, the noise comes back. She made a fool of me in front of 32 recruits last night. She walked into a kennel and stood still, Carver said. The dogs did the rest. In front of 32 recruits, Hayes repeated slower this time, like each word was a stone he was placing deliberately. In an assessment I organized, in front of my personnel, my K9 unit, my training yard. He picked up the cold coffee and then put it back down without drinking it. I have spent 22 years building this program. I have standards that exist because I built them. And a woman with a fabricated file just walked through those standards like they weren't there. Carver said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Hayes was not wrong about what had happened. But Hayes was also not asking the right question, and Carver had spent enough years beside this man to know when his judgment was being run by his ego rather than his intelligence. And this was one of those times, and pointing it out directly would accomplish nothing except making Hayes dig harder. What are you planning? Carver asked instead. Hayes sat back down. I'm filing a formal review request for her placement, he said, requesting a full credential verification through the Central Personnel Office. If her record has holes, the verification process will surface them. He paused. And in the meantime, I'm going to make sure she earns every hour she spends on this base through legitimate channels. No more quiet corners, no more flying under the radar. She's going to demonstrate her qualifications openly on record under observation. Carver nodded slowly. And if she passes... Hayes looked at him. Everyone has a limit, he said. I'll find hers. It was said with the certainty of a man who had never found a limit he couldn't force into view. Carver walked out of the command building and stood in the morning air and thought about Rachel Morgan standing in that kennel perfectly still while 4 dogs circled her like planets finding orbit. He thought about the look on her face when she walked out. Not relief, not triumph. Just the same settled patience she walked around with every day, as if everything that happened to her was something she had already accounted for and filed away. He thought about what Hayes had said, everyone has a limit. And he thought quietly, privately, in a place he would not speak out loud, because he valued his career and his relationship with Hayes, and his ability to operate in the space between 2 very different kinds of people. Maybe, but I don't think you've ever met someone like her before. He went to find coffee. Rachel was already at the K9 facility when Brooks arrived at 0600. She was outside the kennel run, not inside, standing at the fence with both hands loose at her sides, in the posture he'd now come to recognize as her default state of simply existing in a place without demanding anything from it. Titan was at the opposite side of the fence, pressed against the chain link, as close to her position as the barrier would allow. Brooks stopped when he saw it, because that dog had not voluntarily approached a fence line in months. He had not sought human proximity. He had not pressed himself toward contact. He had done the opposite, maintained distance, treated every approach as a potential threat, made himself as large and unpredictable as possible to drive people back. Right now, he looked like a dog who had found what he'd been looking for. "You're here early," Brooks said, coming up beside her. "I couldn't sleep much," Rachel said. She didn't look away from Titan. "He okay overnight?" "I checked at 0200. He was settled." Brooks studied her profile. "First time I've been able to say that in a long time." She nodded once. "Hayes was in the command building all night," Brooks said. "Carver texted me at 0430, asking if I had anything additional on your credentials." "What did you say?" "I said I had nothing on file beyond standard base personnel records." Brooks paused. "Which is true." She looked at him then. "I told you last night I wasn't going to say it out loud," he said. "That's still true. What I think I know isn't mine to say." He met her eyes. "But I need to know one thing." "Ask." "Are you here officially? Is there an authority above Hayes that sanctioned this placement?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "There's an authority above Hayes that's aware of my placement," she said carefully. "Whether sanctioned is a more complicated word." Brooks absorbed that. "So if Hayes pulls hard enough on the right thread, then the thread becomes visible," she said. "Yes. Is that a problem?" "It depends on what he does with it." She looked back at Titan. "Some things are better resolved quietly. Some things need to be surfaced." She paused. "I was hoping for quiet." "Hayes doesn't do quiet," Brooks said. "No," Rachel agreed. "He doesn't." They stood in silence for a moment. Titan had not moved from his position at the fence. One of the Malinois, the female-designated Sable, had drifted closer, moving with the loose-limbed ease of a dog who has decided a situation is safe without entirely committing to that opinion yet. "Tell me about them," Rachel said. "Each one. What happened?" Brooks looked at the dogs. Something shifted in his face, not grief exactly, but the particular heaviness of someone who has watched unnecessary damage happen and been unable to stop it. "Titan first," he said, "because his story is the longest." He talked for 30 minutes. He told her about Titan's original handler, a staff sergeant named Gould, who had been one of the best in the program and who had been killed in a vehicle accident on base 18 months ago. Not in combat, not on a mission, just a senseless accident on a Tuesday afternoon. He told her that Titan had been with Gould for 4 years, which in dog years was most of his adult life, and that the bond between them had been the kind that trainers talked about as a benchmark, as the example they used when they were trying to explain to new handlers what the goal was. He told her that after Gould died, Titan had been placed with 3 different handlers in succession, each one technically qualified, each one told to be patient, each one lasting between 6 and 11 weeks before the combination of Titan's grief and their inability to bridge it made the situation impossible. "He wasn't being aggressive because he's aggressive," Brooks said. "He was testing, every time. He needed to know if someone was going to stay, and every time they left." "So he stopped trusting the test," Rachel said quietly. "Yes." Brooks looked at her. "Exactly that." "And Sable? Overworked and undersupported. She was deployed too young, pushed through too many high-stimulus environments without adequate decompression time between. The behavioral flags started at month 8 of deployment. By month 14, she was unmanageable in controlled settings." He shook his head. "Not her fault. Not even close to her fault." "And the other 2, Rex and Coda. Rex had a handler who used aversive methods. I won't go into detail, but the complaints were filed, and nothing happened until Rex put the man on the ground, which was the first time anyone actually listened." His jaw tightened. "Coda is the most complicated. She was part of a program trial that got canceled midstream. She was trained for a specific kind of work bonded to a specific team, and when the program ended she was just reassigned. Like equipment." He paused. "She doesn't trust transitions. Any transition. New person, new space, new routine. She reads it all as abandonment." Rachel was quiet. "Brooks," she said after a moment. "Yeah, you've been fighting for them." He let out a slow breath. For a year. 3 formal requests to transfer them to rehab programs. All denied. Budget, logistics, liability concerns. He looked at the dogs. Hayes has been pushing to have them retired out. Which in this context doesn't mean what people want it to mean. I know what it means. He's filed the 3rd paperwork in the last month, Brooks said. I've been sitting on it. Technically, I don't have the authority to block it indefinitely. Rachel looked at him. How long do you have? If Hayes gets his credential review and it comes back with problems, he'll use that momentum to push through the retirement paperwork at the same time. Brooks looked at her steadily. If your position here becomes compromised, these dogs lose their last advocate. Then my position can't become compromised, she said. That's not entirely within your control. No, she agreed. But it's mostly within his. Brooks frowned. Hayes, she said. Everything he's doing in front of witnesses, in front of records. He's documenting his own actions while he tries to document mine. She paused. That's not always the advantage people think it is. Brooks stared at her for a long moment. Who are you? He said. And this time it wasn't a statement built on recognition. It was a genuine question asked by a man who understood he was looking at something larger than what he'd initially thought. She almost smiled. Someone who's been paying attention, she said. The formal review request hit Rachel's personnel file at 0900. She was informed by Carver, who found her in the middle of a standard physical training rotation, and delivered the news with the careful neutrality of a man who had been given a script and was not entirely comfortable reading it. Commander Hayes has initiated a full credential verification review, Carver said. You'll be required to provide original documentation supporting your listed qualifications within 72 hours. Any qualifications that cannot be independently verified will result in immediate reassessment of your base placement. Around them, 3 recruits were doing their best to appear uninvolved while clearly listening to every word. Understood, Rachel said. Do you have questions about the process? No questions. Carver looked at her. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite sympathy. It was more like the look of a man who has handed someone a loaded weapon pointed in the wrong direction and is acutely aware of it. The 72-hour window begins now, he said. The review office closes at 1700. He left. The 3 recruits who had been pretending not to listen stopped pretending. Pryor, who had been one of the 3 at the kennel fence the night before, looked at Rachel directly. In the 6 weeks he'd been at the base, he had treated Rachel with the slightly distanced wariness of someone who didn't know how to categorize her, but last night had shifted something in him, and it showed in the way he was looking at her now, not with the old dismissive curiosity, but with something closer to concern. That's a setup, he said. He's trying to force you out. Keep your voice down, Pryor, Rachel said calmly. He can't do that, can he? I mean, if you're here, you're credentialed. Someone approved your placement. He can't just... He can request a review, Rachel said. That's within his authority. But if your record doesn't... Pryor stopped. He looked at her. He rearranged whatever he'd been about to say. Are you going to be okay? The question landed differently than he'd intended it to. Not as a tactical concern, but as a human one, plain and direct, and a little surprised by itself. Rachel looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. How can you be sure? Because I'm not doing anything wrong, she said. That doesn't always matter. She looked at him steadily. No, she said. It doesn't always. But it matters more than people think when everything is being watched. She paused. Which right now it is. Pryor absorbed that. Then he nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they understand something at a layer beneath the surface of the words. Okay, he said. She went back to her PT rotation. But she was thinking about 72 hours, and about a phone call she hadn't made yet, and about a name she hadn't used in 7 years. The call she made was short. 9 minutes. She made it from the far end of the base perimeter during her evening run from a personal phone she kept for situations exactly like this one. The person who answered said nothing for 3 seconds after she spoke. Then, "I wondered when you'd call." "I need to know the exposure window," Rachel said. "Hayes has initiated a credential review, 72 hours. The placement was filed as a training evaluation contract," the voice said. "The credentials on record are technically accurate but selectively documented. If they pull the backing on the contract authorization, how deep do they have to pull before they hit something that creates a problem?" A pause. "For you, not deep. For them." Another pause. "Considerably deeper." "Will the review surface the program?" "Not directly. But if Hayes contacts the Central Personnel Office and pushes for a live credential audit rather than a document review, there's a flag in the system that gets triggered. That flag generates a notification to my office. And then this stops being Hayes's investigation," the voice said, "and it becomes mine." Rachel kept running. The evening air pulled past her face and she thought about what that would mean, the notification, the pivot the moment Hayes's carefully built offensive became evidence in a different kind of case entirely. "What's the collateral risk to the dogs?" she asked. "Explain." "Brooks tells me Hayes has active paperwork to retire 4 K9s who are candidates for rehabilitation. If the review destabilizes my placement before I can get them officially reclassified, he'll push that paperwork through in the same window." Silence. "That's not a good outcome," the voice said finally. "No," Rachel said. "It's not. How much time do you need with those dogs before they can be assessed for program re-entry?" Rachel thought about Titan pressing against the fence at 0600. About Sable drifting closer with her cautious, loose-limbed walk. About Rex and Coda and what Brooks had told her and what she knew from years of work that most people in this field had never done. 30 days of consistent work, she said. Maybe less. "You have 72 hours before the review." "I know. Rachel." The voice shifted slightly, still controlled, but with something underneath it. "What you're doing there with those dogs, if it works, if you can bring them back to operational status, it'll work." "I know it will. I'm saying that's not a small thing. The implications for the broader program." "I know the implications," she said. "I came back for the dogs. The implications are secondary." A moment of quiet. "You always were terrible at prioritizing your own interests," the voice said. "Good night," Rachel said. She hung up. She kept running. 48 hours. That was how much time she actually had before Hayes escalated past the point where the credential review was his biggest weapon. She had 48 hours to give these dogs enough visible progress that their rehabilitation case became undeniable. She ran faster. She was at the kennel at 0500 the next morning. Brooks was already there. He looked at her when she came through the gate, and he said, "Hayes sent a memo to the K9 unit last night. Formal notification that the 4 dogs are under administrative review for retirement processing." He attached a timeline. "How long?" 30 days. But the memo included language about accelerating the timeline if base liabilities require immediate action. Brooks's voice was flat, in the way that professional people make their voices flat when they are furious and have learned not to show it. "He can accelerate it to 72 hours if he makes the case." "He knows that," Rachel said. "Yes." "He's using the dogs as leverage." "Yes." She stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Then we work today. They're not ready for formal assessment. Titan hasn't been through a structured session in—" "I know what they're ready for," she said. "I'm not talking about formal assessment. I'm talking about documentation. Video documentation of their current behavioral state." She looked at him. "You've been filing paperwork telling people these dogs are manageable candidates. You have nothing on film." Brooks blinked. "The camera system in the evaluation bay. Is it running?" "It runs continuously." "Then let's go make sure the cameras are watching," she said, "while we work." They went inside. What followed over the next 4 hours was something that Daniel Brooks would spend years trying to describe accurately to people who hadn't seen it, and always fall slightly short. It was not a training session in any conventional sense. Rachel did not run the dogs through protocols. She did not use commands or correction systems or any of the structured methodologies that formed the foundation of military working dog certification. She simply worked. She worked with Titan first. She sat on the floor of the evaluation bay, not crouched, not bent, but fully seated, which put her below his eye level, and she waited. She had a tug toy in her lap, and she made no move to use it. She just sat there. Titan stood at the far end of the room. He stood there for 11 minutes. Brooks was watching on the monitoring screen in the adjacent room. He timed it. 11 minutes before Titan moved. Not a rush. Not an approach with teeth or posture or warning. He walked toward her the way a dog walks toward something it is no longer afraid of and has decided to investigate on its own terms, which is the most significant distinction in the world of animal behavior. Voluntary approach versus triggered response. He stopped 2 feet away. Rachel didn't move. He took the last 2 feet in his own time. He lowered his head. She brought her hand up slowly and touched the side of his face, and he stood there, and his tail moved once a slow swing, and Brooks, watching on the monitor, put both hands flat on the table in front of him and exhaled. "Come on," he whispered to no one. "Come on." The camera was running. Everything was on film. Pryor appeared in the doorway of the monitoring room. Brooks turned. "How did you get in here?" "Castillo knows the access code," Pryor said without apology. He looked at the screen. "Is that Titan?" "Yes." "And he's letting her?" "Yes." Pryor stared at the screen. His jaw had a set to it that Brooks associated with people who are watching their worldview expand in real time and aren't sure whether to fight it or follow it. "She's been here 1 night," Pryor said. "1 night, and she's been running past this kennel every morning for 6 weeks," Brooks said. "That's not 1 night." Pryor was quiet for a long moment. "He's going to destroy her," he said. "Who?" "Hayes." Pryor turned to look at Brooks directly. "Whatever she's doing, whatever she knows how to do, he's going to find the thing that takes her down and he's going to use it, because that's what he does." He paused. "I've watched him do it to 3 people in 6 weeks. He finds the crack, and he hits it until something breaks." "Maybe he won't find a crack," Brooks said. "Everybody has one." Brooks looked back at the screen where Rachel was now working with Sable, one hand gentle on the dog's shoulder, while Sable made the specific small adjustment of an anxious animal, learning that stillness is permitted. "I think," Brooks said carefully, "that she came here knowing he would look. And I think whatever he finds—" He stopped. "What?" Pryor said. "I think it might be worse for him than it is for her." Brooks turned back to the monitor. "I think she's been through worse things than Victor Hayes." Pryor looked at the screen. Rachel was talking to Sable now. They couldn't hear what she was saying. "Who is she?" Pryor said. It was the same question Castillo had asked the night before. It was the same question that everyone who watched Rachel Morgan long enough eventually asked. And standing in the monitoring room watching 4 military dogs respond to a woman that Hayes had intended to humiliate Daniel Brooks felt the answer pressing up against the inside of his chest like something that needed to be said. But he didn't say it, because it wasn't his to say. That truth belonged to Rachel. And when the time came, when Hayes pushed far enough and the system pivoted, and everything that had been buried came back into the light, it would land with the kind of weight that a quietly spoken truth always carries when it's been held long enough. Not like an explosion, like a door opening. The camera kept running, the dogs kept working, and somewhere on the other side of the base, Victor Hayes was making phone calls, pulling threads, getting closer to the thing he thought would end her. Getting closer without knowing it to the thing that would end him. Hayes made 9 phone calls in 24 hours. Carver knew because he handled 3 of them personally, routing the connections, sitting in the outer office listening to Hayes' side of conversations that were becoming increasingly terse as each call failed to deliver what Hayes needed. By the eighth call, the terseness had compressed into something colder and more deliberate, the tone of a man who has been told no enough times to recognize that no has a pattern, and the pattern means something. The ninth call was different. Carver heard Hayes go quiet in a way that was not the quiet of someone listening politely. It was the quiet of someone who has just been handed information that requires processing before response. It lasted almost 45 seconds. Then Hayes said, "You're certain?" And the person on the other end said something that Carver couldn't catch, and Hayes said, "Send it to my secured terminal," and hung up. Carver waited. Hayes came to the doorway of the inner office. His expression had the specific arrangement of someone who has found what they were looking for and is not entirely sure yet whether finding it is good news or complicated news. "There's a flag in her personnel record," Hayes said. "Not in the primary file, in the administrative backing layer. A contract authorization reference that doesn't match any standard training evaluation format I've seen." "What kind of contract?" Carver said. "That's the question." Hayes looked at the terminal on Carver's desk. "When the document comes through, I want you to trace the authorization chain. Find out who signed off on her placement. Find out what office it routes back to." Carver nodded slowly. "And if it routes somewhere that's above our clearance level, then we'll know something important," Hayes said. He went back inside. Carver sat very still for a moment. Then he pulled out his personal phone and sent a single text message to a number he'd had for 2 years and never used. "She's about to get company. Heads up." He sent it to Daniel Brooks. Brooks was in the evaluation bay with Rachel when the message arrived. He read it. He didn't say anything immediately. He watched Rachel work Coda through a loose attention exercise, the dog's entire body oriented toward her with the focused intensity of an animal that has decided someone is worth paying attention to, which 4 days ago would have been impossible to imagine. "Hayes found something," Brooks said. "Rachel didn't break her rhythm with Coda. The contract flag. You knew it was there. I knew it would surface if he went deep enough. What does it connect to?" She brought Coda through the end of the exercise, released the dog with a low word, then turned to look at Brooks. "It connects to a program that was classified and then declassified in stages over the last 3 years, she said. The outer layer of the documentation is visible to someone with Hayes's clearance. The inner layer is not." "What's on the outer layer?" "Enough to make him more aggressive," she said. "Not enough to tell him what he actually needs to know." Brooks absorbed that. "So he's going to find a partial answer and interpret it the worst possible way." "That's what partial answers are for," she said. "And the inner layer." She looked at him for a moment. "The inner layer," she said, "is what ends this." Brooks held her gaze. He had worked with enough people in sensitive roles over his career to understand that there were conversations you had and conversations you didn't have, and the line between them was not about clearance levels or regulations. It was about timing and trust, and the specific geometry of who needed to know what, before what happened next. He didn't push. "How long before he goes loud?" he asked instead. "He already sent a query to the Central Personnel Office," Rachel said. "When they receive it, the flag gets triggered." She paused. "At that point, it stops being a base-level credential review." "What does it become?" "An inquiry," she said. "With a different office in the chair." Brooks' eyes sharpened. "Who?" She picked up the tug toy and glanced toward Sable, who had been watching the whole exchange from the other side of the room, with her ears slightly forward. "Someone who's been waiting for Hayes to give them a legitimate reason to look at this base's K9 program for about 14 months, Rachel said. She tossed the toy. Sable exploded off her haunches to catch it. Brooks watched, and his mind was doing very fast math. "Rachel," he said, "tell me straight. Did you come here to fix the dogs, or did you come here because someone needed leverage on Hayes?" She brought Sable back through the retrieve, worked the release, then looked at Brooks with the kind of directness that doesn't have room for softening. "Both things are true," she said, "and neither one cancels the other out." Brooks was quiet for a moment. "The dogs needed someone," she said. That's real. That was always the primary reason. But the program also needed something to change, and Hayes was the reason it hadn't changed, and I was asked if I was willing to serve both purposes at once. She held his gaze. I said yes. Because you could. Because somebody had to, she said. And I was the one with the history with these animals. Brooks nodded slowly. Something was settling in his expression. Not approval exactly, more like the specific relief of a man who has been alone in a fight for a long time and has just confirmed he wasn't imagining the person standing beside him. Okay, he said. Okay. Okay, I'm still in. I was already in. I just wanted to know where I was standing. The corner of her mouth moved. You're standing on the right side of it, she said. The document hit Hayes's terminal at 1400 hours. He read it 3 times. The contract authorization for Rachel Morgan's placement at Camp Blackridge traced back to a program office that Hayes had never heard of, which was unusual in itself. He had been operating in military training and personnel for more than 2 decades, and he had a working knowledge of most program offices that interacted with base-level training commands. This one had no familiar name. Its designation was a string of numbers and an office abbreviation that meant nothing to him. But the authorization level was clear. It was significantly above his. Hayes stared at that for a long time. Then he called Carver in. Pull everything you can find on this office, he said, and read the designation aloud. Carver wrote it down. His face did not change. And find me the name of the person who signs their authorizations. Carver went to work. What he found in the next 2 hours was not much, and the not-muchness of it was more informative than a complete file would have been. The office had a functional record budget allocations, a general program description that was heavy on vague language and light on specifics. A list of approved base placements going back 4 years that included 8 names, all of them listed in the same selectively documented format as Rachel Morgan. 7 of those 8 names had blank records in the standard personnel system. The 8th had a partial record with a note attached program evaluation status. Contact authorizing office before action. Hayes found the note on the 8th name and went very still. Someone put a tripwire, he said. Carver looked at the screen. It appears so. On all of them, Carver checked. He went through each of the 8 names methodically, which took 11 minutes, and at the end of those 11 minutes, he turned to Hayes and said, 7 of the 8 have a similar notation, inactive. The 8th Morgan doesn't have the notation. Why not? I don't know. What's different about hers? Carver thought about it. Her placement is active, he said. The others are historical. Maybe the notation only appears after the placement closes out. Hayes looked at the screen. Or maybe it's missing because someone expected the record to be reviewed while the placement was live and didn't want the tripwire visible. Carver said nothing. She's operational, Hayes said. The word came out with the weight of a conclusion that had taken a long time to reach and landed harder because of it. She's not a recruit. She's not a training evaluation. She's operational. She's here doing something specific, and her record has been built to absorb exactly the kind of review I've been running. Sir, Carver said carefully, if that's true, it means I've been running an investigation into someone who expected to be investigated, Hayes said. His voice had the quality of a man controlling something that wanted very badly to become anger. Which means every step I've taken has been what anticipated, possibly. By her or by whoever placed her here, Carver kept his face neutral. I don't know. Hayes stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. He stood there for 45 seconds without speaking. File the query to the Central Personnel Office, he said. Full audit request. I want this office's authorization basis. I want the program description, and I want the name of the officer who signed her placement. Carver hesitated. Just barely. Just long enough for Hayes to catch it. Sergeant? Yes, sir. File it. Carver filed it. And somewhere in a secure office that was not at Camp Blackridge, a flag was triggered. Rachel's phone vibrated at 16:53. She was with Titan in the evaluation bay working through a long patience exercise, sitting with him while he moved through the specific agitation cycle that had made him impossible for previous handlers. Not trying to suppress it, just staying present through it, consistent and unbothered, which was the only thing that actually resolved it. She looked at the message. It's filed. Clock is running. She put the phone away. Titan looked at her. I know, she said. He made a low sound that wasn't a growl, more like a question. We're okay, she told him. He settled. The thing about dogs that most people didn't understand, the thing that had taken Rachel years in the worst conditions imaginable to understand fully, was that they didn't read what you said. They read what you were. They read the biological truth of your state, the things your body communicated below the threshold of conscious control. Heart rate, breath pattern, micro-tension in muscle groups you didn't know you were tensing. The specific electrical quality of genuine calm versus performed calm, which were entirely different things, and which a dog with Titan sensitivity could distinguish in under 3 seconds. He had been testing her since she'd arrived. Not aggressively, not with the explosive challenges he'd thrown at the handlers before her. He'd been testing her the way a grieving animal tests the world when it's trying to decide whether it's safe to trust again. Quietly, continuously, through small moments that accumulated into a picture. She had passed, not because she was perfect, not because she never felt the weight of what was coming with Hayes, or the pressure of the 72-hour window, or the phone call she'd made and the machinery it had set in motion, but because she felt those things without letting them become noise in the space between her and Titan. That was the work. That was all the work. Being honest enough with your own state that you could hold it clearly without projecting it onto something that was trying to read you. She had learned that in places she never talked about, in rooms she was never supposed to be in, with a dog whose name she still didn't say out loud if she could help it. She pressed her forehead lightly against the top of Titan's head. He went still. 30 days would have been enough, she said quietly. But we've got what we've got. Hayes walked into the K9 facility at 0800 the following morning. He did not announce his arrival. He did not go through Brooks. He came through the administrative entrance with Carver behind him, and 2 base security officers flanking at a respectful distance that was close enough to be a statement, and far enough to preserve the formality of the visit. Brooks intercepted him before he reached the evaluation bay. Commander? Brooks' voice was level. Can I ask the purpose of this visit? Inspection, Hayes said. I have authority to conduct facility inspections at any time. Yes, sir, you do. I'd ask for advance notice as a standard courtesy when animals are in active behavioral work, but if this is urgent... It is, Hayes said, and moved past him. He pushed the door of the evaluation bay open. Rachel was inside with Rex. She had the dog in a long down position, a stay exercise, and was standing at the far end of the room. When the door opened, Rex's attention flicked toward it, and he shifted slightly. Rachel said one word low and steady. Rex settled back into position. Hayes stood in the doorway. He looked at the dog. He looked at Rachel. His expression did the calculation that anyone who had been following the last 48 hours would recognize, assessing how what he was seeing connected to what he needed it to mean. Impressive, he said. The word was not a compliment. It was a preamble. Sergeant Brooks runs a good program, Rachel said. She walked toward Rex's position, reached him, released him with a word. The dog shook out and sat beside her, oriented toward her knee. I've submitted a query to the Central Personnel Office regarding your placement here, Hayes said. Full credential audit. I expect the response within the next 24 hours. He paused. I want you to know that directly from me, so there's no confusion about what's happening. Thank you for telling me, Commander. The audit will require you to be available for a formal review session once the response is received. No training activities. No K9 facility access. You'll report to the administrative building and wait to be called in. Brooks made a sound from the doorway behind Hayes. Controlled, barely. Is that also standard procedure? Rachel asked. It is when there are questions about a candidate's right to be on this base, Hayes said. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, not frightened, not even particularly reactive. She looked at him the way you look at something you understand completely. "Commander," she said, "when was the last time you lost someone?" The question landed in the room with enough weight that even the security officers behind Hayes visibly registered it. Hayes blinked. "Excuse me." "A soldier," she said. "Someone under your command. When was the last time?" "That is not relevant to." "Titan lost his handler 18 months ago," she said. "Not in combat, in an accident, and for 18 months nobody on this base understood that what they were looking at was a dog in grief, not a dog with a behavioral problem, because grief is harder to document than aggression." She held his gaze. "You've been planning to retire him, to end him, because the paperwork didn't have a box for loss." The room was very still. "I'm not here to make you look bad," she said. "I'm here because these dogs needed someone to see them. That's the whole reason. And if your audit turns up something that changes my status here, that's a problem for me to manage." She paused. "But those dogs will still need someone after I'm gone. And I genuinely hope that by the time this resolves, you understand that enough to not sign that retirement paperwork." Hayes stared at her. His jaw was set. His posture had the rigidity of a man who is being spoken to in a way he has not been spoken to in a very long time, possibly ever, by someone who is not yelling or accusing or performing someone who is just telling the truth in a clear voice. He didn't have a response ready. For the second time in 3 days, Victor Hayes did not have a response ready. "I'll be at the administrative building when the audit response arrives," Rachel said. "You don't need to restrict my access in the meantime. I'm not going anywhere." Hayes turned and walked out. The security officers followed. Brooks let them pass and then turned back into the evaluation bay. He looked at Rachel. Rex was still sitting at her knee, completely unbothered by any of it. "That," Brooks said after a moment, "was either the bravest thing I've ever watched someone do in a non-combat setting. Or," she said, "or the most strategically precise." "Can't it be both?" Brooks almost laughed. "Almost." "The 24 hours," he said. "What happens if the audit response comes back and Hayes gets enough to escalate before the other office can respond?" "He won't," she said. "You can't know that. I can know that the query he filed triggered a notification that was received by 17:30 yesterday," she said. "And I know that the office that received it does not move slowly." She reached down and put a hand on Rex's head. "By the time Hayes has his audit response, the ground has already shifted." At 0900, a call came through to the Camp Black Ridge Base Commander's office. Not to Hayes, to Colonel Margaret Sutton, who commanded the installation and whose office was sufficiently above Hayes in the chain that he reported to her quarterly and spoke to her in the hallways with the calibrated respect of someone who understood rank without particularly enjoying it. The call lasted 22 minutes. Sutton did not speak much during those 22 minutes. She listened. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She said, "Understood," 4 times. At the end, she said, "I'll handle it from here," and hung up. Then she called her aide in and said, "Get me Commander Hayes." Hayes arrived at her office 11 minutes later. He walked in with the posture of a man who believes he is about to receive validation. He sat down. Sutton looked at him across her desk with the expression of a woman who is about to have a conversation she did not particularly want to have. "Victor," she said, "I need you to walk me through every action you've taken regarding Recruit Morgan over the last 7 days. In sequence. Don't leave anything out." Something shifted in Hayes's posture. Not collapse. Not yet. Just the first small recalibration of someone who has walked into a room expecting one thing and sensed another. "The credential review. Start from the beginning," Sutton said. "The kennel incident." Hayes started from the beginning. He talked for 8 minutes. Sutton did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Victor," she said, The office that placed Morgan here. Are you familiar with what they do? I wasn't before this week, he said. The program description was, they conduct evaluation placements, Sutton said. They place specialized personnel in active training environments to assess the real-world conditions of those environments. She paused. Not the personnel they place, the environments themselves. Hayes went very still. They have been watching this base's K9 program for 14 months, Sutton said. The treatment of the 4 dogs in your facility, the retirement paperwork that has been filed and obstructed in cycles, the management approach to military working dogs flagged for behavioral issues. She looked at him steadily. Morgan was placed here to document the current conditions and make a case with evidence for a program restructuring that 14 months of standard reporting had failed to produce. Hayes said nothing. He was doing the math. The math was very bad. Every action you took against her. Sutton said, from the kennel incident forward, the public assessment, the credential review, the facility access restrictions, the retirement paperwork, acceleration has been recorded. By her, by Brooks, by the camera system in the evaluation bay that has been logging continuously since she arrived, and now by the office that received your audit query yesterday afternoon and notified me this morning. Hayes's mouth opened. He closed it. You didn't expose her, Sutton said. You documented yourself. The silence in that office was the loudest thing Hayes had heard in 22 years. The audit response you requested will still come back, Sutton said, and you'll want to read it carefully, because what you'll find is that Rachel Morgan's actual credentials, her full unredacted record, are significantly more extensive than her placement file suggested. She paused. She was given the option to have the full record visible or minimized. She chose minimized. Why? Hayes said. His voice had changed. The authority was still there by habit, but underneath it something had gone hollow. Because she wanted to be evaluated on what she did here, Sutton said. Not on what she did before. Hayes looked at his hands. For a long moment, he was just a man sitting in a chair. Not a commander. Not a 22-year legacy. Not a reputation. Just a man who had spent a week building a case against someone and had built it perfectly, so perfectly, that every piece of it had turned back toward him like a mirror. What happens now? He said. You're going to read the audit response, Sutton said. And then you're going to walk to the K9 facility. And you're going to have a different kind of conversation with Sergeant Brooks and with Morgan than the conversations you've been having. She held his gaze. The retirement paperwork for those dogs is being suspended pending program review. Morgan has been formally authorized to continue the rehabilitation work. Her status on this base is confirmed and documented at a level that is not subject to your credential review process. Hayes was quiet. And the record of this week, he asked, is part of the case file, Sutton said. What happens with it depends significantly on what happens next. She let that sit. Hayes understood what she was telling him. He stood up. His posture when he stood was different, not broken. Hayes was not the kind of man who broke cleanly but reshaped by weight in a way that would not fully resolve. He walked to the door. He stopped. The dogs, he said without turning around. I wasn't thinking about them as... He stopped again. I know, Sutton said quietly. Hayes walked out. Carver was waiting in the hallway. One look at Hayes's face told him everything. He fell into step beside his commander without saying anything. They walked back toward the command building in silence. At the halfway point, Hayes said, She knew. Yes, Carver said. From the beginning. She knew what I was going to do. Probably. And she came anyway. Carver looked at him carefully. She came for the dogs, sir. Everything else was... He paused, choosing the word. Secondary. Hayes walked another 20 feet. She asked me when the last time I lost someone was, he said. Carver didn't respond. I lost a corporal, Hayes said. 11 years ago. IED. He kept walking. I stopped letting people matter after that. It was easier to build a system. Carver stayed quiet. "A dog grieved for 18 months, Hayes said, and I called it a behavioral problem." He didn't say anything else. He went inside. And in the evaluation bay across the base, unaware of exactly what had just happened in Sutton's office, but aware that something had shifted in the way the morning felt, the way the base's background noise had changed its texture, the way Brooks had come in and exhaled in a very specific manner that said something resolved, something moved. Rachel Morgan was sitting on the floor with Titan's head in her lap. She was not doing anything. She was just sitting there. Titan was asleep. The camera in the corner ran its quiet tape, and outside in the kennel runs, Rex and Sable and Coda were in the loosest, most settled positions any of them had held in close to a year. Not cured, not fixed, but safe. Finally, for the first time in a very long time. Safe. The audit response arrived at 1400 hours. Hayes read it alone. He had asked Carver to give him the room, which was unusual enough that Carver had simply nodded and closed the door without comment, because in 22 years of working alongside this man, he had learned to read the specific register of requests that were not about logistics. That request had been about something else. Something Hayes needed to do without a witness. The document was 43 pages. Hayes read every one of them. He read them the way you read something that keeps rewriting what came before it slowly. At first, then faster as the shape of it became clear. Then slowly again when the full weight of what he was holding landed and needed to be absorbed rather than consumed. Rachel Morgan's actual name was Lieutenant Rachel Walker. He had suspected something like this. Sutton had prepared him for it in the broadest possible terms. But knowing a fact is coming and meeting it on the page are different experiences. And Hayes sat with the name for a moment before he kept reading. Lieutenant Rachel Walker, 14 years of active service. 8 of those years classified under a program that had no public designation. Former Navy SEAL support operator, one of a small number of women integrated into SEAL operational support teams in a classified pilot program that had never been officially announced and had never been officially ended, only quietly folded into a larger framework when the politics of acknowledging it became complicated. Canine specialist. The kind of specialist Hayes read that gets a separate section in a file because the ordinary fields don't have enough space for what she had done. She had handled dogs in 6 different countries. She had trained animals that went on to save the lives of people whose names would never appear in the public record. She had twice walked into situations. Hayes read the operational summaries, scrubbed of location and date, but not of circumstance, where extraction teams had been cut off and the only functioning navigation asset was a dog, and she had brought both the dog and the team out. She had been decorated 4 times. None of those decorations had public citations. She had been promoted twice in a rank structure that didn't officially exist. And then 7 years ago, a mission had gone wrong in the specific way that classified missions go wrong when the gap between what was planned and what was possible becomes a canyon that people fall into. Her team had been compromised. 3 operators lost. The dog she had worked with for 4 years. Hayes found a single line about this, almost a footnote, the kind of detail that gets included in a file, because the people writing it understood that it mattered, even if they couldn't explain why, had not come back. She had submitted her resignation 8 days after the mission closed. The resignation had been denied. She had submitted it again. It had been denied again. The 3rd time, someone above her chain of command had apparently understood what she was actually asking for, because the 3rd submission had resulted in a different kind of separation, not a discharge, not a resignation, but a reclassification. She was moved from active status to program reserve, which meant she was technically still connected to the military apparatus in a way that could be activated but was not actively deployed. She had spent the next 6 years working in civilian canine rehabilitation, not as a business, not with a facility or a formal program or any of the infrastructure that would have made it visible. She had worked with individual dogs referred to her through networks that moved by word of mouth among people who had served and come out the other side, knowing what military working dogs actually went through and who actually cared about what happened to them after. She had rebuilt 14 dogs in 6 years, 14 dogs that various facilities and programs had written off. 14. Hayes sat with that number. Then he kept reading. The section on her placement at Camp Blackridge was the last section of the document, and it was the shortest, and it was the one that hit the hardest. The placement had been proposed by the program office 14 months ago, concurrent with the first internal flags about Camp Blackridge's K-9 handling practices. It had been structured as a training evaluation contract because that cover provided the best conditions for an honest assessment. If Rachel arrived under any other designation, the people being assessed would perform differently. She had been asked if she was willing. According to the file, her response had been 3 words. What about the dogs? She had been told that if her evaluation documented what the preliminary concerns suggested, the dogs would be protected under the program review findings. Their retirement paperwork would be suspended and their cases would be independently assessed. She had agreed on that basis. Not for the program, not for the institutional objectives, not for the case that would be built against Hayes's management approach or the restructuring that would follow. For 4 dogs that nobody else was fighting for. Hayes closed the file. He sat in the silence for a long time. He thought about what he had said to Carver. Everyone has a limit. I'll find hers. He thought about the kennel, the gate closing, the laughter he had permitted, the moment he had framed as a lesson, and which had in fact been one, just not the lesson he had designed. He thought about what she had said to him in the evaluation bay. I'm not here to make you look bad. And he understood fully for the first time that she had meant it literally. She had not come to Camp Blackridge to expose him. She had come for the dogs. His exposure had been a consequence of his own actions documented by his own hand in full view of witnesses he had assembled himself. She hadn't set a trap. He had built one and walked into it. Hayes picked up the file. He stood up. He walked out. Brooks was in the K-9 facility running afternoon assessments when Hayes walked through the door. No security officers, no Carver. Just Hayes alone with the file under his arm and a look on his face that Brooks had never seen there before. Not humility exactly, because Hayes was probably constitutionally incapable of humility in the pure form, but something adjacent to it. Something that involved being present in a room without controlling it. Where is she? Hayes said. Evaluation Bay 2, Brooks said. He studied Hayes's face. Sir? Hayes looked at him. You knew. I had a strong suspicion. For how long? Since week 3, Brooks said. The way she worked the perimeter, the way the dogs responded before she ever got close to them. He paused. I've read about handlers that dogs recognize on approach. I'd never seen it. I thought it was probably overstated. He glanced toward the evaluation bay. It's not overstated. Hayes absorbed that. Why didn't you say something? Because it wasn't my information to give, Brooks said. And because I believe she was here to help. And the rest of it, the program what she was actually here to document. Brooks was quiet for a moment. I suspected there was more to the placement than a training evaluation, he said. I didn't know the specifics. He held Hayes's gaze. Would it have changed anything if I had? Hayes didn't answer that. He looked at the door to evaluation bay 2. I need to speak with her, he said. Brooks moved aside. Hayes walked to the door. He stood there for a second. He knocked. Which was, as Brooks would later reflect, the single most significant thing Hayes had done all week. Not the file. Not the walk across the base. Just that knock. The decision to knock on a door rather than open it. Rachel was with Coda. She had been working on something specific with the dog for the last hour, a trust-building sequence that involved Hayes doing exactly nothing for long stretches, just staying in the room while Coda adjusted to her presence, then slowly introducing low-level stimulus and watching how Coda managed the transition. It was slow work. It was not the kind of work that produced dramatic visible results in the short term. It produced results that accumulated over days and weeks in a dog's nervous system, rewriting the reflexive equations that had been installed by a history of bad transitions. When the knock came, Coda's ears went up. Easy, Rachel said. She went to the door. When she opened it and saw Hayes standing there alone, her expression did not change visibly. But something in her posture shifted a very slight readjustment, the kind of thing that a person does when a situation moves into a different category than the one they had been managing. "Commander," she said. Hayes held up the file. "I read it," he said. She looked at the file, then at him. "All of it," she said. "All of it." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." Hayes came in. He looked at Coda, who had retreated to the far side of the room, but was watching him with the alert, calculating attention of an animal that is doing real-time assessment rather than reacting on instinct. That Hayes noted was already different from what he'd been told about Coda's behavior. 4 days ago, Coda had been a dog that could not manage new people in her space. Right now, she was managing. "She's come a long way," Rachel said, reading his attention. "She's not there yet, but she's tracking instead of reacting. That's the first step." "How long does the rest take?" "For her specifically, 3 more weeks of consistent work, maybe 4. Hayes looked at the file in his hands. He turned it over once, then put it under his arm. "I put you in that kennel to embarrass you," he said. Rachel waited. "I thought—" He stopped. Tried again. "I thought you were someone who was performing confidence without having earned it. I've seen that before. In my experience, the ones who are too calm are usually hiding inadequacy." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong." "You were working with incomplete information," she said. "I had enough information to know I was taking a risk with those dogs," he said. "I chose to take it anyway. That's on me, not on the information." He held her gaze. "I want to be accurate about that." Rachel looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "That's it. What would you like me to say, Commander?" "I don't know," he said. "Something. Anything that tells me where we go from here." She turned and looked at Coda, who had taken 2 slow steps toward the center of the room, toward Hayes's general direction, which 3 days ago would have been inconceivable. "You know what Coda's problem is," Rachel said. "Brooks described it as fear of transitions," Hayes said. "More specific than that. Her problem is that every time she committed to a situation, the situation ended without warning. She was bonded to a team, and then the team was gone. She was moved to a new program, and then the program was canceled. She spent the last year treating every new thing as something that's going to disappear before she can afford to trust it." Rachel paused. "That's not a behavioral problem. That's a rational response to an irrational amount of loss." Hayes watched the dog. "She's coming toward you," he said. Coda had moved another step, slowly, tentatively, but voluntarily, toward him. "Because you knocked," Rachel said. Hayes looked at her. "You knocked before you came in," she said. "She heard it. Small thing, but she reads every signal. The knock said you were asking permission. That's different from every other time someone has come through that door this week." She watched Coda cover the last few feet and stop 2 feet from Hayes, head lowered, the posture of cautious inquiry. "She's asking if you're safe." Hayes looked at the dog. 70 pounds of animal that could not manage new people in her space 3 days ago. Looking at him, asking. He did what Rachel had done on the first night slowly. Without making a production of it, he crouched down. He put his hand out, palm down. Coda sniffed it. She didn't retreat. Hayes felt something happen in his chest that he was not going to name in front of anyone, that he would not name alone in the dark that night, but which was unmistakably real and unmistakably significant, and had something to do with 11 years and a corporal he had never fully mourned, and a system he had built around not letting things matter. "I lost someone," he said. 11 years ago, I told Carver this morning, I stopped letting—" He stopped. He looked at his hand where Coda's nose was still resting. "I thought I was building something durable, standards, a system that didn't depend on individuals." "You were protecting yourself," Rachel said. Not accusatory, just clear. "Yes. That's human. It's not good command," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." Coda pressed her nose harder against his palm. Hayes made a sound that he covered quickly. He stood back up. He straightened his jacket. Colonel Sutton has initiated a full review of the K9 program, he said, returning to the professional register with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 20 years living there. I've been asked to cooperate with the assessment. I intend to. He paused. I've also been told that my retirement authorization for these 4 dogs is suspended pending the review outcome. I know, Rachel said. The review will take 60 days. During that period, you've been authorized to continue the rehabilitation work independently. He held her gaze. I won't interfere. Thank you. I'm also. He stopped again. This one was harder. I'm requesting through Sutton's office that the footage from the kennel incident be reviewed by the program office as part of the assessment record. He said it flatly, the way people say things they have decided to say before they can talk themselves out of it. My conduct that evening should be part of the record. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. That's a significant thing to do voluntarily, she said. I'm aware. Why? Hayes looked at Coda, who had returned to her corner, but was lying down now rather than standing at alert. The difference in dog body language between watchful and resting. Because you're right that it was documented whether I requested it or not, he said. And because choosing to include it myself is different from having it surfaced against me. He looked back at Rachel. I've spent 22 years telling recruits that accountability is the foundation of service. Seems like I should be able to demonstrate it. Rachel held his gaze. Yes, she said. It does. He nodded once. He turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. Walker, he said. The name hung in the room. Rachel didn't react visibly to it. She had known it was in the file, had known that reading the file meant he now had access to a name she hadn't used in 7 years. But something in her was absolutely still, in the way things go still, when something important is being said. Those operators you lost, Hayes said, without turning around. 7 years ago, I'm sorry. A long pause. Thank you, she said. He left. Brooks was waiting outside the door. He looked at Hayes as he passed. Hayes didn't stop, didn't speak, just walked toward the exit, with the careful posture of a man carrying something that required his full attention to hold correctly. Brooks watched him go. Then he pushed the evaluation bay door open. Rachel was standing with her back to him, one hand on the wall, head slightly bowed. He didn't say anything. She straightened after a moment and turned around. Her eyes were clear. He used my real name, she said. I heard. First time anyone here has said it out loud. Brooks nodded. She walked to Coda's corner and crouched beside the dog. Coda's tail moved once small, contained but real. Rachel put her hand on the dog's back. Tell me about Gould, she said. Titan's handler. What was he like? Brooks was quiet for a moment, caught by the shift, the way she moved from something that had just been enormous to something necessary without requiring a transition. Good man, he said. He came and sat on the bench along the wall. Funny. Obscenely funny, actually the kind of person who could make a room laugh in situations that had no business being funny. He had a way with dogs that was almost unfair. They just liked him immediately. No work required. He paused. He and Titan were matched early, first week. Usually the matching process takes time, but with those two it was, when something just clicks and you don't need to explain it. Yes, Rachel said. He talked about Titan the way some people talk about family, not in a sentimental way, in a practical matter-of-fact way, like Titan was a partner whose opinion he genuinely respected. Brooks looked at the door toward Titan's run. When he died, I didn't know how to tell the dog. I know how it sounds. It doesn't sound strange, Rachel said. I just stood in his run for about an hour, Brooks said. I didn't have any words for it. I just stood there because I didn't know what else to do. That was right, Rachel said. Being there was right. Brooks looked at her. You've done this before, he said. Lost a dog. She kept her hand on Coda's back. "Yes," she said. He didn't ask more than that. Some things you don't ask more than that. Pryor found Castillo and Briggs at 2000 hours in the common room. He had been carrying something around all day, a specific kind of restlessness that comes from knowing more than you can verify and less than you need to feel settled about it. He had heard about Hayes walking to the K9 facility alone. He had heard through the inevitable base rumor apparatus that processed information faster than any official channel that Hayes had read something in the audit that had changed his face. "Something happened today," he said, dropping into a chair across from them. "Several things happened today," Castillo said. "With Hayes. He went to the K9 facility, alone, and he was in there for—" Pryor checked his phone. 37 minutes. With her. Briggs looked up from whatever he'd been reading. "Did he come out the same way he went in?" Castillo asked. Pryor thought about that. "No," he said. "He came out different." "Different how?" Pryor tried to find the right word and landed on smaller, not weaker, just smaller, like he'd been taking up more space than he actually needed and had figured that out. Castillo was quiet. "She did something," Briggs said. "She does things," Pryor said. "That's the whole issue. She does things without making a production of it." She walked into that kennel and stood still, and 4 dogs that everyone on this base had written off decided she was worth trusting. And now Hayes, who has been running this place like a machine for 20 years, went in to talk to her, and came out looking like a man who just finished a conversation with someone who was right about something he didn't want to be wrong about. Castillo looked at him. "What's in her actual file?" "I don't have clearance for her actual file." "Does anyone here?" Sutton, Pryor said. "Hayes now, and Brooks probably has pieces of it." "Then what do you actually know?" Pryor leaned forward. "I know she's not a recruit. I know her record is classified at a level that triggered a response from a completely separate office the moment Hayes submitted his audit request. I know that she's been working in that K9 facility for 4 days, and 4 dogs that nobody could touch are now sitting in the same room as Hayes voluntarily." He paused. "And I know that last week Hayes was going to have those dogs put down, and today that order is suspended." The room was quiet. "She changed his mind," Castillo said. "I think she changed something bigger than his mind," Pryor said. "I think she changed what's possible here." Briggs set down what he was reading. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. They both looked at him. Briggs was the quiet one. When he said things, they landed differently. "She asked to go in that kennel." "Hayes sent her in," Pryor said. "No. Carver told her what was coming, and she had time to refuse or object, and she didn't. She walked in." Briggs looked at the table. She knew what was going to happen. With the dogs. She knew they were going to respond to her. She'd been communicating with them on her runs for 6 weeks. He looked up. She let Hayes build the whole thing, the assembly, the audience, all of it. She let him create the situation that she then walked through in front of 32 witnesses. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a group of people arrives at the same understanding at the same moment. "She didn't fight him," Castillo said slowly. "She just stood still and let him prove her point for her." "Yes," Briggs said. "That's not luck," Pryor said. "That's not even just training. That's someone who's been doing this for a very long time," Briggs said. "Operating in situations where the wrong move ends everything. You get really good at knowing which situations you don't have to force." They sat with that. "She's going to leave eventually," Castillo said. "When the review is done, and whatever she came to do is done, she goes." Nobody answered right away, because nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking, which was that 6 weeks ago Rachel Morgan had been the stranger who wouldn't explain herself, and now the idea of her leaving felt like the idea of something essential being subtracted from a place that hadn't known it was missing anything. "Maybe she stays," Pryor said. Briggs looked at him. "People like that don't stay," Castillo said. "Maybe this one does," Pryor said. Yeah. That night, Brooks pulled out a folder he had been keeping for 14 months. In it were his 3 formal requests for program review, all denied. Photographs he had taken of the 4 dogs at their worst moments. Not to be cruel, but to document the baseline, the starting point of something he had believed could get better, even when everyone around him treated it as settled. Notes in his handwriting about individual sessions, individual breakthroughs, individual setbacks. A single sheet with Titan's name at the top and a list of things Titan had done in the last year that were better than the week before, a list that was heartbreakingly short and heartbreakingly specific. Things like allowed vet tech to approach without vocalizing, ate full meal without interruption, slept through perimeter check. He added a new entry. Pressed forehead into handler's palm. Eyes closed. Slept in oriented position 3 consecutive nights. He sat back. He thought about what Rachel had said someone had to. He thought about the way she'd said it, not like a declaration, not like heroism, just the plain factual assessment of someone who had looked at a situation and calculated what it required. He thought about 7 years and 14 dogs, and a name that wasn't on any public record, and 4 combat decorations that nobody outside a classified file would ever know about. He closed the folder. He went to check on the dogs. Titan was already lying in the position he'd started sleeping in 2 nights ago, body oriented toward the door Rachel used when she came in, like he was keeping track of where she'd be. Brooks stood and watched him for a moment. "I know," he said quietly. "Me too." He turned off the light. In the dark of the facility, in the specific quiet of an institution that has been running on one set of rules for a long time, and has just begun to understand that those rules need to change, 4 dogs breathed easily. And in the morning, Rachel Walker would come through the door, and they would all know it before she arrived. The 60-day review began on a Monday and moved with the deliberate institutional momentum of something that had been building for 14 months and was finally being allowed to move. Colonel Sutton ran it herself. That detail was not lost on anyone at Camp Blackridge. A base commander personally chairing a program review was unusual enough to signal that this was not a routine audit. It was a reckoning, careful and structured and wrapped in the language of administrative process, but a reckoning nonetheless. Sutton had spent 14 months receiving reports she couldn't act on without evidence, and now she had evidence assembled by a woman who had walked into a kennel and stood still and let the institution document its own failures in front of 32 witnesses. She moved efficiently. The first week of the review produced 3 formal findings. The first was a systemic documentation failure in the K9 behavioral assessment process, a gap between what was being observed and what was being recorded, that had allowed 4 animals' deteriorating conditions to be classified as liability rather than injury. The second was a handler training deficiency that had been flagged in internal reports twice and addressed neither time. The third was harder to write and harder to read a pattern of management decisions that had prioritized optics over outcomes in the K9 program for a period of not less than 18 months. Hayes read all 3 findings. He signed the acknowledgement forms without requesting modifications. Carver, who had been present for the signing, said nothing about it until they were walking back to the command building. Then he said, "That took something." "It took a pen," Hayes said. "Victor." Hayes stopped walking. He turned. Carver had been beside him for 9 years and had called him Victor exactly 4 times. Hayes could remember all 4 occasions. "I know what it took," Hayes said, "and I know what it would have cost not to." Carver nodded. They kept walking. What neither of them said, but both understood, was that the version of Hayes who had locked a woman in a kennel 3 weeks ago would not have signed those forms. That version of Hayes would have fought every finding, requested independent review, used every procedural tool available to dilute and delay, and ultimately survive the assessment with his record intact and his authority unquestioned. Something had changed. It had changed in an evaluation bay with a dog named Coda pressing her nose against his palm. It had changed in a 43-page file that he had read alone. It had changed when he had knocked on a door instead of opening it. Rachel didn't attend any of the review sessions. Her role in the formal process had ended when the flag was triggered and the program office took over. She was a source, a documented record, a baseline of evidence. But the review itself was institutional machinery, and institutional machinery worked better without the people whose stories had set it in motion standing in the room while it ran. She spent the 60 days in the K9 facility, every day, every morning before anyone else was awake, and most evenings after everyone else had stopped. The work with the 4 dogs moved at the pace the dogs set, which was not a fast pace, but was a consistent one, and consistency was the only thing that mattered. You could not rush trust. You could not schedule it, or optimize it, or compress it into a timeline that served administrative convenience. Trust built at the speed of demonstrated reliability, which meant it built one day at a time, and sometimes took 2 steps backward before it took 3 steps forward, and you had to be willing to accept that mathematics without letting it become discouragement. Rachel was willing. She had been willing for a long time. By day 14, Titan would follow her from room to room in the facility without a lead. Not because she had trained him to, because he wanted to. Because he had decided through the accumulated evidence of 14 mornings and 14 evenings of her being exactly who she said she was, that where she went was where he wanted to be. Brooks watched it happen the first time, Titan rising and following, as Rachel moved toward the supply room, his gait loose and easy, his whole body oriented to her movement with the specific attentiveness of a dog who has found his person, and he stood in the hallway and felt something release in his chest that he had been holding for 18 months. He called it in his notebook, voluntary following behavior restored day 14. No lead, no prompt. 4 words that were the most significant 4 words he had written in a year and a half. By day 21, Sable was running off lead retrieve sequences with the kind of focused drive that had made her exceptional before the deployment damage had buried it. Not perfect. Not without occasional shutdowns when the stimulus became too complex. But working. Actually working in the way military working dogs work, when they are matched correctly to a handler and a purpose, and given the foundation they need. Brooks upgraded her behavioral assessment from flagged to monitored. That was the first status upgrade any of these 4 dogs had received in over a year. Rex progressed fastest. He was the dog who had been most recently damaged, and whose trust, once established, consolidated quickly. The way some people, once they understand the injury was specific and not universal, are able to move past it with an almost surprising efficiency. By day 18, he was accepting handling from Brooks, as well as Rachel, which was the first multi-handler tolerance he had shown, and the clearest signal that his healing was not dependent on a single person, but had become something more portable. Coda took the longest. Of course she did. A dog who fears transitions needs more of them done carefully before she learns that transitions are survivable. Rachel had to introduce every change in the smallest possible increment, a new piece of equipment, a different route through the facility, a new person entering the space, and each time she had to stay present through Coda's entire adjustment cycle, which could last minutes or much longer without hurrying it toward resolution. Some mornings it was hard. Not because Rachel doubted Coda, but because patience has its own weight, and some days the weight is heavier than others. And on those days, Rachel would sit with Coda and think about the mission that had ended everything 7 years ago, and the dog she had not brought home, and the 8 days that had followed before she finally stopped filing the resignation that kept getting denied. She thought about those things, and she sat with Coda, and she let herself feel the weight of them without letting that weight become noise in the space between her and the dog. That was still the work. It was always the same work. Hayes came to the K9 facility on day 30, not for an inspection, not with security officers, not with paperwork under his arm. He came in the morning early enough that Brooks wasn't there yet, and he stood at the fence of Titan's run and he waited. Titan came to the fence. Hayes put his hand flat against the chain link. Titan sniffed it. He didn't retreat. Rachel found them like that when she arrived at 0545. Hayes and Titan separated by a fence, making the specific careful contact of two things that have recently done damage to each other and are figuring out if something else is possible. She stopped. Hayes heard her and turned. "I'm not interrupting anything," he said. "No," she said. "How long have you been here?" 20 minutes. He looked back at Titan. He came to the fence on his own. "He does that now?" she said. "With people who come quietly." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "My corporal's name was Davies," he said. 11 years ago. He was 24. He had a dog back home, used to show me pictures of it every chance he got." He looked at Titan. "After he died, I couldn't look at dogs for about 2 years. I didn't make the connection until last week." He paused. "I think I've been punishing these animals for something that has nothing to do with them." Rachel came to stand beside him at the fence. "You didn't know you were doing it," she said. "That's not really an excuse." "No," she agreed. "But it's a reason. Reasons matter for what comes next." Hayes looked at her. "What does come next for you?" "I finished the work," she said. "The review closes in 30 days. The dogs need another 30 of consistent work before I'd be comfortable calling their rehabilitation stable. And after that," she looked at Titan, who was still at the fence watching them both with his quiet, evaluating gaze. "There are other dogs," she said. "Other bases, other situations, other animals that have been written off by people who didn't know how to read what they were seeing." She paused. "There are a lot of them." Hayes was quiet. "You're going to keep doing this," he said, "moving from place to place, fixing what other people broke and then moving on." "I don't think of it as fixing," she said. "More like introducing the possibility that something different is true. The dogs do the rest." "Still," Hayes said. "Alone." She looked at him. "I work with people like Brooks," she said. "I'm not alone." "But you move," he said, "and he stays. And eventually, the place you built something in becomes somewhere you used to be." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's the job," she said. Hayes looked at Titan. "I want to learn," he said. "How you do this, what you see when you look at them." He said it simply, without hedging, without the defensive architecture that had surrounded everything he'd said to her for the first 3 weeks. "Not to run the program. Brooks runs the program. But I've been commanding this base for 4 years, and I've walked past that K9 facility twice a day and never understood what was happening inside it." He paused. "I'd like to understand." Rachel studied him. "It starts with the fence," she said. "What do you mean?" "What you did this morning. Coming here quietly before anyone else was around and standing at the fence and waiting." She nodded toward Titan. "That's not nothing. That's actually where it starts." Hayes looked at his hand, still flat against the chain link. Titan's nose was an inch from his fingers. "He's going to let me touch him," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. It was the slow recognition of someone watching something happen that they hadn't thought was possible. "Eventually," Rachel said. "Maybe not today, but you'll know when." Hayes stood very still. Titan's nose touched his fingers. Hayes didn't move. Titan held the contact for 3 full seconds. Then he stepped back. Hayes exhaled. "Day 31, Rachel said. "Come back tomorrow." He nodded. He came back. "Chuai." The day the review findings were formally delivered, Pryor asked Rachel directly. He had been building up to it for 2 weeks. Castillo had told him to leave it alone. Briggs had said if she wanted them to know, she'd tell them. But Pryor had a specific kind of persistence that manifested as questions he couldn't stop carrying around, and this was the question he'd been carrying since the first night at the kennel. He found her after evening work in the K9 facility, when she was doing final checks on the dogs before locking up. "Can I ask you something?" he said from the doorway. "You're going to, regardless," she said. He almost smiled. "Your name. Your real name. I heard Brooks use it once when he didn't know I was nearby." He paused. "Walker." She looked at him. Is that the part you were going to ask about? She said. No, he said. The part I was going to ask about is you could have told us, from the beginning. You walked onto this base with a record full of decorations and classified operations and 14 years of the most specialized work in the program, and you let Hayes treat you like a problem recruit for 6 weeks. He held her gaze. Why? She locked the supply cabinet and turned to face him fully. Because if I had walked in here with the full record visible, she said, everything that happened would have been about the record. Hayes would have been deferential. The recruits would have been performing. The review findings would have been about what someone with my background observed. She paused. Instead, they're about what happened. What actually happened in front of witnesses documented in real time, because nobody knew to behave differently. Pryor was quiet. You needed it to be real, he said. The dogs needed it to be real, she said. The review needed it to be real. The changes that come out of this they'll hold because they're based on evidence nobody can dispute. Not my word against Hayes's, not credentials versus credentials. She looked toward Titan's run. 4 dogs who couldn't be touched on film over 60 days. That's the case. Pryor thought about that. What about you? He said. What about me? Did you need it to be real personally? She looked at him. He was 23 years old, and he was asking the right question, with the straightforward directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften the things he was curious about. She had found over the years that the people who hadn't learned to soften their questions often got better answers. Yes, she said. He waited. When I left, she stopped, started again. When I was reclassified 7 years ago, I had a record that said I was exceptional, decorated, successful. She paused. And I had lost 3 people and a dog, and I hadn't been able to stop any of it. The record and what I knew about myself were 2 completely different documents. She held his gaze. I needed to come back as nobody. I needed to start at 0 and do the work and find out if what I believed I was still true. Not the record. Me. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when something true has been said in a place that deserves it. Is it, Pryor said, still true? She looked at Titan. Titan, who was lying in his oriented position, body angled toward the door she used easy in his rest. Ask me in 30 more days, she said. Pryor nodded. He started to leave. Pryor, she said. He turned. You're going to be a good handler, she said. When you get there, you ask the right questions. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Thank you, he said. He left. She stood alone with the dogs. The formal review findings were released on day 60. They ran to 87 pages and produced 11 recommendations, 4 of which were classified as immediate implementation requirements. The K9 behavioral assessment process was to be revised and standardized across all connected base programs. Handler training would be extended by 6 weeks and include a mandatory unit on animal stress indicators and grief response in working dogs. All 4 dogs at Camp Blackridge were reclassified from liability status to active rehabilitation candidates, and a new position was created, K9 Program Welfare Coordinator, reporting directly to the base commander rather than through the training command chain. Brooks was appointed to the role the same day the findings were released. He read the appointment letter twice. Then he walked to the K9 facility and sat down on the bench in the evaluation bay and put his face in his hands for about 30 seconds. When he looked up, Rachel was in the doorway. I heard, she said. 14 months, he said. His voice was steady. Everything else about him was not. 14 months of paperwork going nowhere, and now there's a position. There's a position because you spent 14 months filing paperwork that went nowhere, she said. The record existed. It just needed the right moment. Brooks looked at the ceiling. What do I do with this? You build something that lasts past both of us, she said. He looked at her. You're leaving. Not yet. But eventually, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. How long? He said. 30 more days, she said. I want Coda stable. I want all 4 of them assessed by an independent evaluator with documentation that's clean enough to survive the next person who tries to challenge their status. And then, she sat down across from him. There's a program in Georgia. 6 dogs, similar situation. Different causes, same outcome. Someone requested a placement through the office. Brooks absorbed that. They're sending you in the same way. Similar structure, she said. Adapted to the situation. Who's in Hayes's role there? A woman, actually, Rachel said. Different problem. Not cruelty. Burnout. A program that's been understaffed for 3 years and is making bad decisions because nobody has the capacity to make good ones. Different medicine, Brooks said. Same dogs, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Does it work? He said. Every time. No, she said. Not every time. Some situations are too far gone before anyone asks for help. She paused. But most of the time, if you get there while there's still something to work with, yes, it works. Because of you. Because of the dogs, she said. I just make the space. They do the rest. Brooks shook his head slowly. You've been doing this for 6 years, he said. Moving from place to place, walking into broken programs and standing still until they find their own way back. More or less. And nobody knows. The people who need to know, she said. The rest of it. She shrugged. The rest of it doesn't matter. Brooks looked at her for a long moment. It matters to me, he said. She held his gaze. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. Titan's formal re-evaluation happened on day 83. An independent assessor arrived from a program office 2 states away, a man named Kellerman, who had 20 years in military working dog evaluation and who had, according to Brooks's research, never once softened a finding to accommodate what a base wanted to hear. He was the right person for this. The findings needed to be bulletproof. Hayes requested permission to observe. Kellerman granted it. Sutton came as well, which was not in anyone's plan, but which nobody questioned, because Sutton had earned the right to see this particular outcome. Pryor, Castillo, and Briggs were not supposed to be there. They were there anyway. They stood at the back of the observation area, not technically violating any protocol, because they were not in the assessment space itself, just present in the building in a way that happened to provide a sightline to the evaluation room. Nobody sent them away. Kellerman ran Titan through a 45-minute assessment sequence. Behavioral compliance checks, stress response evaluation under controlled stimulus, handler responsiveness, multi-person tolerance, transition management, the full battery of metrics that determined whether a military working dog was operational monitored or retired. Rachel handled him throughout. She worked him the way she always worked, with the economy of motion and the absolute consistency of someone who does not perform for observers, who is the same whether anyone is watching or not, which was in fact the most significant thing about her, and the thing that most set her apart from every other handler Kellerman had evaluated in 20 years, though he would note it in his report simply as demonstrating exceptional handler stability. At the end of the 45 minutes, Kellerman made notes for 11 minutes, while everyone in the observation area held a version of collective stillness. Then he looked up. "This dog is operational," he said. The word went through the room like something physical. Operational. Not monitored, not flagged, not liability. Operational. Brooks made a sound. Sutton closed her eyes for 2 seconds and opened them. Hayes stood very straight and said nothing, and looked at Titan, who was sitting at Rachel's left knee with the specific composed attention of a dog who has been through what this dog had been through and has come out the other side knowing exactly who he is and who he trusts. In the back of the room, Pryor grabbed Castillo's arm. She grabbed it back. Kellerman assessed Sable next. Operational. Rex. Operational. Coda. Kellerman took longer with Coda. He ran 2 additional sequences that he didn't run for the others because Coda's profile was more complex and Kellerman was thorough. 16 additional minutes during which the room's collective stillness became something closer to held breath. Kellerman put down his pen. "Monitored status," he said. "Progressing toward operational. Recommend reassessment in 45 days. He paused. "This is a dog with exceptional capability and a complicated history. She's not finished yet, but she's working." Brooks exhaled. Monitored progressing toward operational was not operational, but it was not retired. It was a door left open. For Coda, who had spent her whole life watching doors close, that was everything. Dad. Rachel found Hayes afterward. He was standing alone outside the facility. Not pacing, not on his phone. Just standing the way people stand when they have finished something large and are not ready to move to the next thing. "Congratulations," she said, coming to stand beside him. He looked at her. "This wasn't my success. Your base produced 4 operational dogs from a situation that had been documented as unrecoverable for 14 months, she said. The review findings went out under this base's letterhead. The K9 Welfare Coordinator position is the first of its kind in the Connected Program Network. She paused. Those things belong to this place, and this place is yours. Hayes was quiet. You could have burned it down, he said. Everything I'd built here. The documentation was enough. The kennel incident, the credential review, all of it. If the program office had wanted to, they had enough to end my career. Yes, she said. Why didn't they? Because ending your career wasn't the objective, she said. Building something better was. He looked at her. You argued for that, he said. Sutton told me. The program office wanted to recommend a command change, and you argued against it. She didn't confirm or deny it. Why? He said. She thought for a moment. Because you knocked, she said. He blinked. On the evaluation bay door, she said. Day 3 of the review. You came alone and you knocked before you came in. And in that room with Coda, you crouched down. You put your hand out. She held his gaze. People who are willing to do that to make themselves small in the presence of something they've been afraid of, those people can change. I've seen it in dogs 100 times. I've seen it in people too. She paused. You were worth the investment. Hayes looked away. He was quiet for a long moment. When you leave, he said, what do I do if something goes wrong again? If someone in my command makes the same mistakes I made? You'll know what to do, she said. How can you be sure? Because you just asked the question, she said. People who are going to make the same mistakes don't ask that question. He nodded slowly. The morning was brightening around them, and somewhere inside the facility, a dog made a sound, not agitated, not alarmed. Just a dog making the sound of being present and awake, and in a place that was safe. Titan. Hayes recognized his voice now. He had learned to recognize all 4 of them. On her last morning at Camp Blackridge, Rachel woke before dawn. She did not pack much. She had not arrived with much. There was a discipline to the way she moved through the world that came from years of understanding that the things that mattered were not the things you carried with you. She went to the K9 facility one last time. Brooks was there. She had not told him what time she was leaving. He was there anyway. They didn't say much. There was not much to say that hadn't been said across 86 mornings in this space. She worked with each of the dogs. One last session. Not formal, not structured. Just being with them the way she had been with them every day, consistent and present and entirely herself. Titan last. She sat on the floor with him, the way she had sat on the first night, and he came to her and put his head in her lap, and she put both hands on the sides of his face, the way you hold something you need to memorize. You're okay, she said. He was still. You know what to do, she said. You've always known. You just needed someone to wait. She sat with him for 20 minutes. Then she stood. He stood too. She walked to the door. He followed her to the door. She turned and looked at him. He sat. She left. Brooks walked her to the gate. Pryor, Castillo, and Briggs were there. She didn't know how they knew. They were just there the way people who pay attention are always in the right place without being told. Pryor didn't say anything. He stood straight, and for a moment he looked considerably older than 23. Castillo said thank you. Briggs said nothing. But he nodded once, the particular nod of someone who means something they don't have words for. Hayes was there too, at the far edge of the group. He was in full uniform, and he stood at attention, and when she met his eyes, he held the look, not the posture of a man managing his image, but the posture of a man who has something to say that doesn't fit in any of the words he knows. She met it. She nodded. He nodded back. She walked through the gate. Brooks watched her go until she was out of sight. Then he turned back to the base. He had a program to run. He had 4 dogs who needed their morning work. He had a position that had never existed before created because a woman had walked into a kennel and stood still and refused to let the world's interpretation of her replace the truth of what she was. He went back inside. In the evaluation bay, the camera that had run continuously for 86 days kept running. Titan went back to his spot. He did not go to the oriented position, the one angled toward the door Rachel used. He lay down facing the center of the room. It was a small thing, but Brooks noticed it. It meant Titan was no longer waiting for someone to return. He was simply in his space, grounded, present, belonging to no one's absence, healed. Some wounds close with noise, with confrontation and revelation, and the public architecture of accountability. Some close quietly in a room where a dog decides he is safe and lies down facing forward instead of facing the door. Both kinds of healing are real. Both require someone willing to do the hardest thing, to wait without flinching for trust to arrive in its own time. Rachel Walker had known that longer than anyone at Camp Blackridge. She had known it in 6 countries and 14 dogs, and one mission that had taken everything and 7 years of building herself back from nothing. She had walked onto this base as no one. She had left it as exactly who she was. And 4 dogs who were told they were lost proved something that no report, no credential, no decorated file could prove more clearly. The quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones who change everything. Not by force, not by noise, but by the simple, immovable act of being exactly what they are and refusing to become anything less. They had thrown her to the dogs to break her. The dogs had simply recognized her, and the woman who arrived as nobody left as the person this place would measure itself against for years to come.